The main kind of support concentrates around the geopolitical central position of being kind of between the East and the West. Robert Fico terms as a politic of four world directions, so that we need to be kind of friendly with each of the sides of the conflict. And it does definitely find significant support within the population, which is not anti kind of Ukrainian per se, but rather subscribes to the kind of narrative that the West is the kind of main culprit. It's also not the majority, likely not the majority of the population, but it's a fair share of that. And Robert Fico was simply very, very good in kind of pulling on the threads immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine of elements such as economic fear of the regional war. Also, Slovak society never really kind of cultivated this kind of traumatic memory of Russian encounters as the Poles did, for example.
Mm.
I mean, in Poland, this is a ritualized kind of relation to Russia that has some sort of historical roots. In Slovakia, I mean, one of the kind of liberal narratives is, of course, this kind of backwardness, is that the Slovakia, there was a pan-Slavic movement in the 19th century, and we have cultivated a relation to Russia that is very positive. Yes, but at the same time, I think that what this position also owes to is the wide discontent in how the 90s and 2000s went down. Is, I would say, a big disappointment with the West. Part of that is the culture wars. I mean, many people subscribe to this kind of declinist narrative of liberal West, and a kind of declining values of Europe, and a threat to conservative values. And many people are simply kind of feel lied to, I guess, and have assumed the position that basically is very distrustful to whatever the kind of Western or EU elites seem to be arguing.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. My name is Alex Hochuli. I'm in São Paulo, Brazil, and my co-host is Philip Cunliffe in Canterbury, England. Hi, Phil.
How's it going?
Very well, very well. I'm excited to be talking about Slovakia today, and to do that, we're going to be helped by Dominik Zelinksy, who is joining us. He's a sociologist at the Slovak Academy of Science. Hi, Dominik.
Hey, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited to be having this conversation. I'm excited to learn about whether Slovakia is suffering from neoliberal order breakdown syndrome, which you suggested there might be some people there who are. So I'm excited to hear about that. Just a little introduction. We're going to talk about Slovakia, which is, if you don't know, a small country of about, I think, 5 million people in Central Europe that shares a border with Austria to the west and Ukraine to the east. The reason that we're interested in talking about it here specifically, I think, on BungaCast is twofold. Firstly, there's the questions of populism, of anti-politics, and of ideological scrambling that we've been long interested in discussing and understanding on this podcast. And secondly, because of the context of emerging multipolarity and competition between East and West, and Slovakia is a country that I think interestingly finds itself maybe playing both sides, or in some way a bit more torn between the two sides than other neighboring countries. On the 400th episode of this podcast, a kind of anniversary show we did, highlighting issues that we wanted to be raising and bring to people's attention over the forthcoming 5 to 10 years. One of the issues we highlighted was the way multipolarity would play out in the internal politics of countries around the world. And I think Slovakia is maybe an interesting case in that regard. It's a member of the EU and of NATO since 2004. It's been a member of the Eurozone since 2009. but it's also been pretty resistant to providing military aid to Ukraine. I think, according to polls, I don't know if these have changed since I've got these numbers, but only 40% of the population holds Russia solely responsible for the war, which is in pretty strong contrast to many of its neighbors. And support for NATO membership itself is falling. The Prime Minister, Robert Fico, who we're going to talk a lot about in just a second, has said, "I'm against the membership of Ukraine in NATO and I will veto it. It would be merely a basis for World War III, nothing else. Ukraine is not an independent and sovereign country, but under the total influence and control of the United States." All very interesting stuff, particularly in the context of, again, a NATO and EU and Eurozone membership. All right, so let's get
And
started.
not to mention the fact there was the assassination attempt as well.
Well, exactly. So, yeah, just
It might
I was holding
actually,
that.
if you could
Go.
actually, maybe I think to start with that, Dominik, it'd be interesting to hear because obviously once the it's kind of faded away and it's obviously been overshadowed since with the assassination attempt on Trump. But some people even drew the dots, seeing it as kind of assassination attempts on these leading kind of anti-globalist figures. So could you update us as to what the latest is or any of the fallout,
Yeah.
the blowback
Well,
in Slovakian
yeah.
politics?
I mean, I guess the person who actually kind of connected the dots was actually the guy who tried to assassinate Donald Trump, who was looking up on Google, Robert Fico, just shortly before he kind of went on to shoot. And actually, kind of funny enough, today I guess it's the day of the official kind of closure of the assassination period, because Robert Fico today, quite in a celebratory mood, went back to the kind of place of the deed. And well, the situation, I guess, is the following. Basically, generally, there is very little information about what really happened. We don't really know the extent of Robert Fico's actual injuries. Nobody was really kind of either fired or penalized for any sort of kind of bodyguard security detail failures. There is really, really very, very little information. But basically, I mean, Robert Fico kind of is back to business as of last month, which is fairly amazing given the kind of at least prima facie extent of injuries that he suffered from the assassination attempt. But it's shaken up really the politics internally very, very much. So I mean, it kind of increased very much the pressure of the governing coalition on the opposition, because the interpretation that Robert Fico has is that basically this was a plan of the opposition, and that the shooter was an opposition activist, which doesn't really seem to be true. I mean, he seems to be a sympathizer of the opposition, but not really. I mean, a person without really any kind of personal connection to the political parties. And it also kind of, I think it's kind of ushering in also a new ideological era, because since Robert Fico kind of re-entered the politics after the immediate rehabilitation, he's been also spinning basically the story that this was an attempt by what he calls large Western democracies to punish the kind of sovereign position that Slovakia has taken in the international politics. So he's turned it into this kind of geopolitical victimhood story of basically European Union through its minions of the opposition taking revenge on an autonomous politician.
And how far are ordinary Slovakian voters? How far are they picking it up? Like,
well, that's a good question. I mean, we don't really know. I mean, if you look at the polls, they virtually didn't really change. I mean, there was a lot of expectation that this would lead to some sort of sacralization of Robert Fico, that he would be that it will be a major breaking point for a Smer, but that really didn't actually materialize. We also saw that, I mean, it happened very, very shortly before the European election, and the expectation would be that this would lead to a landslide for Smer. But quite surprisingly, it actually didn't. And the main kind of oppositional force, the Progressive Slovakia, which is a party that started as a center left, but is more like center right, I would say by now.
who would be the analog in kind of the US or Britain? Would you say?
I think that's very hard to say, but let me say that they are in the Renew faction in the European Parliament. It is a kind of party that started as as a technocratic but slightly left wing. Subject, but basically has been since then kind of vacuuming up the remainders of the center right voters in Slovakia, the kind of urban electorate.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, so basically they won the European elections. So in an interesting kind of twist that not really many people, I think, including me, expected, uh, the assassination attempt only somewhat consolidated the power camps within the country.
It's interesting. I guess there's a kind of a parallel with Trump in a sense, because when the photos of him kind of standing defiant, surrounded by the Secret Service guards with the American flag behind him, everyone assumed, well, there you go, he's won.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
But
think
since
you did,
then,
and I did both as
uh,
well.
I mean,
I
yeah,
did as
it
well.
was, yeah, we all did. I mean, I'm sure everyone did, not least Democrats. But since then, obviously, if the polls are to be believed, kind of his lead is far more slender, or perhaps even evaporated since Kamala took over from Biden.
Yeah,
But just
sure.
one
No, I
more
mean,
question on the
mhm.
assassination. I was just curious. So, has anything? Because again, the kind of the story of the assassin in the US has been completely memory hold. But I was wondering if anything more has come out about the assassin in Slovakia, about
Yeah.
his motives and his political background. Because again, very little of this was picked up in the international press.
Yeah, no, no, no. I mean, that's of course correct. I noticed that. So, I mean, we know the basics. We know that he was a pensioner, 71-year-old man with much artistic ambitions throughout his life. He was a poet and writer who wrote.
Sounds familiar, like another Central European.
Yeah. So he was a poet and a writer, and apparently, like throughout his life, he was somewhat of a contrarian figure. Was he definitely wasn't linked to the dissident movement before '89, but he was apparently a figure that was kind of under surveillance for a while by the secret police in the former Czechoslovakia. Uh, in the kind of 1990s 2000s, he voted for a variety of different parties. He was even actually photographed with a kind of pro-Russian paramilitary group coming to their meeting a few years ago. So somebody who really kind of was a nonconformist, oscillating between various kind of contrarian initiatives. But I mean, the only kind of direct information that we have actually comes from a video that was shot by an unknown person so far, probably from the security detail of Robert Fico himself again, or a police force member. Right after the man was apprehended, in which he was saying that basically he was motivated by the steps of the current coalition, which involved kind of statification of the public service, of the public broadcaster in Slovakia, and other kind of similar events that have been the kind of linchpin of the oppositional rhetoric in Slovakia. But
Hmm.
really, I mean, we are at this point, we're just waiting for a release of some sort of reports, because the police was very, very good, kind of asymptomatically for this country, uncharacteristically for this country, in basically safeguarding all information beside what came to be known in the first days. So, well, hopefully in the next weeks.
So no revelations yet that this man has was involved in blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline or anything like that.
We'll see.
Right. So let's turn to some actually quite basic questions. If you could give us maybe a bit of a political biography of Robert Fico. Who is he? Who is Slovakia's prime minister? The longest serving prime minister in Slovakia's
Yeah.
independent
Yeah.
history.
Well, I mean, it's really hard to make it kind of short, because Robert Fico is not only the longest serving prime minister, but he's actually the longest serving Slovak politician as such. I mean, he's longest serving member of the parliament. Um, And basically, I mean, if you look at his career and if you look at his trajectory, it kind of charts out also some of the key turns, basically, of the country's politics. I mean, he's been such a pivotal figure for Slovak politics, and also somebody who was very, very close to many of the most important transformations of the country and of its politics. Fico basically started as a Communist Party member in his mid-20s, in the 1980s. And after the fall of the kind of socialist regime, he remained in the former Communist Party, which by then transformed in what was known as the country of the Party of the Democratic Left, which was a fairly kind of fairly modern post-communist social democratic party, I would say. But he left the party in 1999 over some sort of internal tensions over places in new government, which kind of they got to in elections of 1998. And he founded his own party, which is Smer, that he leads still. And basically, the first plan was to do the Tony Blair thing, to do a third way kind of apolitical left, which really wasn't very left, but it seemed like a good idea at that point. Well, that didn't really last because throughout the next kind of years, Slovakia implemented neoliberal reforms, and Robert Fico kind of found his place as one of the most vocal critics of those reforms, and moved significantly to the kind of socialist left. But then, when he actually won the next elections, he came to govern with nationalist Slovak National Party, and also a kind of very conservative nationalist movement for democratic Slovakia, for which he was also, I think at that point, he had suspended the membership in the European Socialists, as he has, has also now. And by that time, he started moving also to a more kind of conservative positions. There always was an element, I think, to his personality and politics that was rather conservative. I mean, for example, he always was a great defender of the death penalty. I think it's his kind of personal opinion. The first government was also very kind of strongly anti-Hungarian, had a very problematic relation, I would say, to the Roma minority. Things kind of got better eventually when Fico got to govern alone after 2012 elections. But maybe the breaking point for this kind of development, really, the first very strong breaking point, I think it was 2015 and the migration crisis, when much of the kind of European mainstream parties actually started to appropriate more conservative, sometimes even pretty far right narratives, and Robert Fico was, of course, kind of very much following this trend. So the kind of ideology started moving pretty much from some sort of social democracy towards a very kind of conservative left, if you will. Another big breaking point was 2018. Also, if you know something about Slovakia, this was the moment of a great kind of social movement which followed the killing of Jan Kuciak, a journalist, and his fiancée, which led to massive public protests across the country that basically forced Robert Fico, as the head of the government, to step down. It was not only that he had to step down at that point for basically for this killing, but throughout the kind of what came to be basically known was that also he has had a personal assistant that was apparently also his personal partner, but previously she was a partner of a boss of Ndrangheta, Italian mafia in eastern Slovakia. And he's been basically like going out with this girlfriend and taking her out to parties with Angela Merkel without security clearance and stuff like that. So it was a big scandal. Fico eventually had to step down. It was very problematic.
So
Also,
he's this kind of remarkable survivor
yeah,
in Slovakian
yeah,
politics.
and no, I mean this is basically, I mean, after 2018, he receded very much in the politics. In 2020, following these protests, Smer lost elections, and there was a new anti-corruption government, so-called, a kind of government led by a charismatic entrepreneur by the name of Igor Matovic, who's basically the main strategy, or the main kind of goal in politics, was to prosecute Robert Fico personally for corruption, right? And what happened in 2020 is that many people who were actually Smer members decided to leave Smer, to kind of leave this dying party, what seemed to be a dying party, behind, and form the Hlas as a moderate, more modern social democratic party. So Robert Fico was basically abandoned by a lot of his closest people, and people that I were probably in his eyes very much, dependent on him. And he was put in this super precarious position that really made him a survivor. Was that he was abandoned by kind of the closest people, some of the closest people. At the same time, he was under intense, police prosecution. I mean, a lot of people from his immediate vicinity were actually sitting in jail at one point or another throughout the past 4 years. Many of them a few of them were actually convicted. And he himself was prosecuted as well, and there was actually a request to the parliament to hand him out to the prosecution, which didn't pass by one vote. I think two, actually. And at that point, basically, in this kind of corner, Robert Fico did something that is fairly unusual, and he totally turned far right. He kind of turned very much to the disconcerted, kind of desperate electorate of that was, angered by COVID to a large degree, but also people that were very much on the Russia side in the kind of invasion of Ukraine. People who were very much tied to this kind of environment of online alternative media that flourishes in Slovakia very much, and basically, and also anti-vaccination kind of stream of Slovak society. And on the wave of this, he managed to get back to politics, and he managed to win the elections. And basically, he conquered the splinter, the Hlas, the moderate social democracy. He conquered the progressives, and that's how he became a prime minister again in September 2023.
So just two follow-up questions. Maybe an unfair one, but I think one that our listeners will find helpful is there, if you could tell us a bit about his political style and effect, I suppose. Because I'm thinking about, listening to you talk about this, these kinds of the way in which he's traversed the political landscape and the various kind of things he's been embroiled in. There's many figures that I think would be, kind of be obvious points of comparison from European politics, not least our own kind of podcast patron saint, Silvio Berlusconi himself. So I was wondering if Fico kind of also adopts this kind of buffoonish or populist kind of clown persona that Trump and Berlusconi, for instance, have performed. And the other question is, given all these political, given all the kind of changes in his political positioning over the years, is there actually a kind of representative Fico supporter? Or have the people supporting him also changed kind of over time? Or is there a solid kind of power base, a solid geographic or social or class-based kind of constituency that have more or less stuck with him throughout all of these transformations over the course of his political career?
Yeah, that's good. That's a really good question. So, on Berlusconi or Trump or I don't know Boris Johnson or somebody like that. No, Robert Fico is actually antipode of that. If we talk about kind of charismatic politicians like Berlusconi, actually Robert Fico is to a large degree the man of the system. I mean, he's been a partisan all his life. He kind of prides himself in being able to run a complex, internally somewhat democratic party, kind of with a very large, actually one of the largest number of actual members, which is not really a common thing in Slovakia or generally in Central East Europe. I mean, to have a large kind of party membership. So he has that. He was very much able on the structural level to integrate other kind of left-wing forces. And he's never really been a buffoon. I mean, he is somebody who I think is valued by his work, by his voters, for the at least the veil or the appearance of credibility and expertise somehow. I mean, he even kind of adopts this phrase from Charles Robert of Anjou, a medieval Hungarian king, which is "Credo Roberto experto." In Latin, that means trust the skilled Robert. So he's somebody who's really somewhat a very, very serious politician who, and that is pretty funny, for example, compared to Berlusconi, compared to other people like Trump, who, the focus of the media is very much on their private life. Robert Fico has very little private life. I mean, he's not really divorced, but he has a stream of kind of young girlfriends, but it seems like the tabloids are not really particularly interested in that. I'm sure they can also kind of quite arrange that the press is not really super interested in that. Basically, his whole life is politics, and that is his political identity.
You make him sound kind of appealing.
Yeah, well, I think it's also by now it's also the question of major change that he's kind of underwent. I mean, he still is a very professional politician, but he's adopted a very, very, very aggressive rhetoric. For example, I mean, one of the I think most unusual things that I have heard was him quoting the Slovak fascist song from 1940s when Slovakia was a puppet state of Germany. So that was a song which was kind of something like the Horst Wessel Lied in Germany, and Robert Fico was kind of quoting this, and I mean the lyrics go something like beat and cut to the blood, and he was referring with these phrases to the leader of the opposition. So, I mean, he's adopted an extremely aggressive rhetoric, a lot of various dog whistles, and so on. At the same time, it's very hard to gauge to what extent he actually means it, or to what extent this is a really kind of professional performance that he puts out, because he needs, in many ways, to actually stabilize the most radical voters. Because to a large part of the electorate, after this kind of 2018 scandals, after his kind of radical turns, he's also pretty unpalatable by now. So he's really kind of targeting the fringes of the kind of opinion spectrum in Slovakia, which tend to have a very kind of strong position on Ukraine and Russia question, which tend to have a very strong position on vaccination. And that kind of brings me to the second question of who is Robert Fico's voters. And that definitely has changed. I mean, consider that in 2012, Robert Fico won the election with 44% of the electorate, and he governed alone. Since then, I mean, now he's at something like 23%. I think it's. I mean, with parties this size, it's always very hard to just pinpoint one aspect. But let's say that there is an important aspect of age. Robert Fico has the oldest electorate. The Smer has the oldest electorate in Slovakia almost. I mean, around 50% of the people are above 60, 65 years of age. Uh, there's also, I think, an important element of class. I mean, besides the kind of far right positioning that I mentioned, he's been also very consistent in the or fairly consistent in the kind of class element. He's been very very good with class positioning. I mean, he makes a big thing out of the fact that he himself was kind of born into the working class. He tends to do these stunts and work a night shift in a factory, for example. He's in extremely good shape for many, his age. Um, but I mean, then this kind of left-wing positioning also needs to be qualified. I mean, Slovakia is one of the high countries in Europe that has the highest share of night shifts under Robert Fico's government. He's never really done systematically anything about that, but then he kind of takes the time to go and work the night shift, and of course, people love it. So then there's a class element definitely to Smer voter base. It's more of kind of blue collar voters. So
So,
that's some kind of trajectories that I can kind of chart out.
I mean, Phil had already asked about the comparison with Berlusconi, and you've kind of quashed that comparison with Robert Fico. It actually sounds like when you were describing Igor Matovic,
Yeah,
the opposition, it sounds a lot more like a Berlusconi figure in terms of being someone from the business world who kind of mobilizes anti-corruption as a vehicle to challenge someone who's much more of an insider.
yeah.
Is that a fair comparison?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, just consider that Robert Fico never really been an entrepreneur. I mean, he's never really done any kind of private job besides being a politician. Whereas the leaders of the or some of the leaders of the opposition are kind of much more of the ilk of Berlusconi. And I mean, Igor Matovic is a perfect example. He never really owned a television, but he owned kind of a regional leaflet thing which he made a fortune. But he's somebody who's entered politics around 2008 with a party that is called Freedom and Solidarity, and which kind of emerged as a response to the financial crisis. It's a center-right libertarian response to the financial crisis, and that championed the kind of anti-politics that we know probably also from other European countries, basically a model of a party of entrepreneurs who, of course, by being entrepreneurs, know the economics. So they know that you don't regulate the crisis because then it's, of course, much, much worse. And Igor Matovic was somebody who kind of rode this wave, and they entered government in 2010. But very, very soon, the government fell actually over quarrels over the kind of European financial stabilization mechanism, which the party didn't want to support in the government. And basically, the government fell to kind of Robert Fico's eventual success. But what happened also during this period was so-called guerrilla crisis. So somebody placed several transcripts from a one Bratislava flat in which basically the business elite of the Slovakia's kind of venture capital were meeting with politicians and arranging privatization of formerly state properties and other kind of forms of interferences with politics. And this was released on the internet at that point, and it sparked massive protests. It was kind of the first big protests probably after 1989. And it was also very much informed by the Occupy movement that was going on globally at that point. Kind of the populism, let's say, of the era was very eclectic, but it tarnished at that point the reputation of the center right, and the only one who actually was able to turn this into a success was Igor Matovic, because he left the previous party and he formed his new party, which was called Common People and Independent Personalities. It was an anti-party which only had for a very long time, I think, 3 to 6 members, including Igor Matovic and his wife, and other members of his kind of extended family. Now, the new law forced them actually to have, I think, 50 members, but they didn't really have a headquarters. I mean, somewhat crazy to think that later Igor Matovic was the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister, but he's a man who doesn't own a bank account or a debit card for that matter. So he is really the kind of more Berlusconian figure of Slovak politics.
So I'm wondering how you would characterize the way that Slovakian politics polarizes, because as you've described, Robert Fico straddles different positions. The opposition, certainly in the form at least of Igor Matovic, it's kind of pro-business, anti-corruption, and anti-corruption politics to me always seems like a vehicle of opposition in a kind of post-ideological age. It's unable to really speak in the name of anything or really carry a specific banner other than we're against corruption. So I wonder how it plays out. It doesn't seem like it's left-right. Is it liberal-conservative? What are the lines on which Slovakian politics polarizes?
So at this point, actually, it's more of the liberal conservative. I mean, when we mentioned Igor Matovic is one of the leaders of the opposition. Or by now, he kind of receded to the background because he has won actually the 2020 elections on these anti-corruption charges or anti-corruption kind of slogans. And I mean, anti-corruption is, of course, a kind of largely, also middle-class politics, but in some ways, the rhetoric has been so successful in Central East Europe also because kind of it captures the wide discontent with the governing elites, and it kind of has the capacity to at least momentarily express an affect of kind of disaffection with politics. And Matovic was very good in mobilizing these sentiments in 2020 campaign, and he really won the campaign. He formed a government, but basically the government failed horribly during the COVID. Not only because it was kind of set to battle Robert Fico as they kind of tried to put him in jail, but also because basically it was very, very incompetent. So Igor Matovic is but one leader, although very important. But this experience of him being a prime minister kind of forced him by now to recede into the background of Slovak politics because he's become the most hated figure who resided over this chaos of COVID governance. One of the main kind of fault line at this point is, I would say, liberal conservative. I mean, Robert Fico wages the culture war very hard. And currently, basically, Robert Fico has become such a centralizing figure that he himself becomes the most salient, I would say, fault line. It's for or against Robert Fico.
Right.
Which of course kind of makes a farce of a politics. I would say when it's so personalized and so centralized on one figure. So it's for Smer or anti-Smer. And a part of that, of course, is this framing that Smer needs to be defeated somehow in order not to usher in the kind of Hungarian model.
Is there a risk of that?
Sure. Yeah. I think that's. I think that there's two levels. I think that there's a level of rhetoric, on which, of course, it's a little bit perhaps more heated than it is actually on the structural level. But I would say, but that's of course mobilization from both camps. But I think that On the ground, there's kind of concerning signs of various interferences. I mean, it's probably not the full Hungarian model with the changed electoral system, which is pretty hard to do, and especially if you don't have a constitutional majority. But we have seen that the public TV broadcaster was transformed. A lot of kind of cultural institutions were transformed. There's a wave of firing kind of ripping through the ministries who, according to the explicit rhetoric of the government, do not follow the ideological line set up by the new government. But at the same time, there's also big civil mobilization, which I find to be a very interesting process because we've seen, for example, unions are mobilized, which is a very unusual thing for a Smer-led government, because Smer was for a long time very close to Slovak unions.
So, looking maybe at a slightly longer historical timescale, how would you characterize Slovakia's post-communist transition? I don't know if that's something that we can talk about in terms of being successful or not, in terms of growth rates or whatever. You can think of kind of Branko Milanovic's famous back of the napkin kind of calculation of who's done well and who hasn't. How would you characterize it in Slovakia's case?
I mean, if you are kind of if we want to talk about transformation, I mean, so always like, yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, who's done well, who's done kind of not so well. I mean, the basic trajectory of the transformation we probably know, or you probably know from Poland, Hungary, and other kind of Central Eastern European countries. What I find to be a very interesting and under kind of emphasized point is that Slovakia is a country that's 30 something years old, 34, 35 years old, and no, sorry, sorry, 31 actually. And actually, the transformation was the reason for this kind of velvet divorce of Czechia and Slovakia, because Slovakia's transformation was actually much harder than the transformation of the Czech part of the country. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, there was incredible unemployment because Slovakia industrialized only throughout the 50s. And it was kind of a socialist style industrialization of planned economy. And once that fell apart after 1989, well, that led to a kind of very problematic economic situation. And so there's a strong kind of economic element to that, and this basically led to massive conflict, discursive conflict between the Czech elites and the Slovak elites about the nature of the transformation, leading to the divorce of the country. On the side of Slovakia, what happened was that there was a decision to not take at first the shock therapy and kind of find a Sonderweg, find a Slovak strategy of transformation, um, which was kind of done under the banner of the Movement for Democratic Slovakia and Vladimir Mečiar, who was this kind of towering figure of the 90s, and who ushered in a kind of semi-authoritarian government, nearly, with again very very tight connections between the government and the secret service. Once the Prime Minister Mečiar, for example, got into a conflict with the president, the secret service decided to solve the conflict by kidnapping the president's son. And killing a whistleblower. So stuff like this was happening. The emergence of mafia, and
This was so this was before or after Slovakia's entry into the EU,
this was before.
right?
This was 1996, I think.
Okay.
So it was mid 90s. So the Slovakia kind of and what basically the major government did was that instead of this shock therapy, they argued that it would be actually more profitable to go a special way and basically redistribute the kind of the collective wealth towards what they called the local capitalist class, which was the immediate kind of circle of the political leaders. In 1998, also at that point, with the help of the former communists, including Robert Fico, this government fell. And basically, the center right and center left formed a coalition that ushered in the kind of classic neoliberal reforms, privatization, partial privatization of health insurance, partial privatization of pension funds, austerity politics, although Slovakia was never really super rich as a welfare state. Neither in the 90s, neither under communism. It wasn't very kind of luxurious welfare state. But I mean, this also kind of supercharged the unemployment, the transformation. But eventually, I mean, they managed to attract a significant foreign investment that basically contributed to the eventual growth. But I would say that the problem of the main problem of this transformation, besides the kind of classics, is also the regional, the uneven regional development of Slovakia. Slovakia has a very kind of very uneven, one of the highest kind of levels of unevenness in regional development in the EU, because when you kind of course, invite foreign direct investment, then it tends to concentrate around the capital.
What then is the nature of, if at all, of debate on EU or Euro membership? I imagine, like in many places, it was sold as a vehicle and as a road to modernization, to greater wealth and liberty and all the rest of it. How do Slovaks perceive their membership of the EU or the Eurozone now?
So basically, there's I think that if you look at contemporary discourse, I think there's a deep persuasion among the kind of liberal part of Slovak society, or the oppositional part of Slovak society, that basically Slovakia is going to very soon leave the EU because Robert Fico is going to drag us out of the EU and probably kind of include us in the BRICS or something like that. But there really is no debate on that. And Robert Fico himself has been very, very clear that this is never going to happen. Even in the kind of 2020, when he assumed this much more radical political self, and he started to connect with a variety of like alternative, very, let's say, pro-Russian or Russian sympathizing online media, he was always extremely clear that he actually sees European Union as a good thing for Slovakia. But he phrases it in the kind of sovereignist language that Slovakia needs to be in the EU, but needs to kind of dictate its own conditions. And in terms of the population, by the way, if you look at the Eurobarometer numbers or some kind of other comparative surveys, you'll find that very quickly that Slovakia is actually one of the more pro-EU societies within the EU itself. I have fairly fresh data saying that it's something like 20% of people would like to leave EU. So, which is not a insignificant number, but it's a standard number across the EU. It's not something crazy.
It's a very, it's a very interesting picture you portray because, as you say, kind of on the one hand, you have these culture wars,
Yeah.
culture wars politics. On the other hand, you have, like you say, kind of membership of strong attachment to the European Union, but justified in the same terms that people use to leave the European Union or to argue against it. You say kind of he himself, Fico himself, has kind of traversed Slovak politics in different forms and developed kind of a different appeal to different segments of the electorate and so on. And so, I mean, how far is this unique to Slovakia, or do you think it's a pattern that you can see in other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, or maybe further afield?
Well, I mean, I think that this is something that's similar to Hungary in some ways. I mean, which has been also very kind of vocal in stating its position within the EU. Although, I mean, Robert Fico has been so far much more obedient than Viktor Orban. Um, in the Czech Republic, EU is comparatively less popular, but there's also no talk of actual leaving. I mean, we know that so far, I think only one country managed to leave the EU, and look at how long kind of that took. So I don't think I think that even those who basically are feel kind of discontent within the EU or engage with in the kind of culture wars against some of the values that many see as the core of the EU, basically see this as unrealistic. And also let me point out maybe that I think there's a different kind of trends within the recognition of EU importance for people. I mean, many people see Schengen, the economic kind of elements as very important, and they simply see that it's unrealistic economically to leave the EU. And then there's also a sizable share of society that sees it as a kind of cultural, or as they would say, civilizational position
Mm.
that Slovakia should assume. Yeah, but I think I mean I think that this I think that this kind of trajectory is not super unique. I mean, many things that are happening in Slovakia. I mean, there's something that can be said as being unique. Like for example, I mean the kind of working coalition between the far right and let's say the left wing in Slovakia. It's There's not many coalitions like that, I think, but many things simply are reflections of wider trends of European kind of social development and political development.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, let's turn to the bit which I think stands out about Slovakian politics today, at least in one regard, which is this orientation, which is a little bit more to the east, I suppose, than some neighboring countries. What actually has defined Robert Fico's position with regard to Russia and the Ukraine war? Certainly, in terms of being far more outspoken against the Atlanticist alliance.
Yeah. Oh, let me just add also on the EU. I mean, we didn't really mention the NATO, but if EU has been very successful as a project in many ways in Slovakia or with the Slovakian population, then NATO has been very problematic. I mean, there was an EU membership referendum which went successfully, but there never really was a NATO referendum, and that was also seen as a mistake at that point.
So,
So
what explains the difference in attitude towards the two?
we see the support for the NATO falling immediately after the Belgrade bombing, after the kind of campaign on Serbia. We see it as a reaction on the American campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. So basically there was not. Uh, there was always pretty strong opposition to these kind of moves. That was, I
But
think,
they
very.
were, I mean, but that was common. I mean, kind of opposition to Iraq was common around the world. Um, I mean, what translated that specifically into anti-NATO feeling to that degree in Slovakia? Do you think?
I mean, if I were to guess, I would say that, for example, the priming with the Serbian with the Yugoslavian campaign, there was kind of already a very bad start. I mean, there's There's a kind of cultivated link between Serbia and Slovakia in some ways, as this kind of pan-Slavic brotherhood and stuff like that. So I think that that was one of the elements. The other elements was that simply, I mean, that basically there was a strong kind of left wing resistance to the later American campaigns that were associated, of course, with the NATO, even though of course it wasn't that involved. But it also there were kind of strong left wing opposition on the side of people like Robert Fico and his immediate his immediate vicinity, and these people were at that point the main oppositional figures, and the main oppositional figures also with regard to at that point a very unpopular neoliberal government. So I think that they kind of managed successfully to use this political dynamic to set kind of the trends, and I think that there's a path dependency running from there. And there's been long time for a long time there was also a strong kind of anti-Americanism in Slovakia, which is interesting, and
Mm.
which kind of so Slovak sociologists are searching for an answer why. But I haven't really heard a particular one, and I don't really have actually a one. But one of those, I mean, of course, it's that there was the experience of the kind of socialist regime compared to, let's say, the Czechia or Poland was not that kind of catastrophic. There was a lot of regional development, industrialization, and from there again goes some sort of path dependency in value orientations of the population. But yeah, if that explains anything.
And well, and I mean, if that does explain something, how is that leveraged into the position on Ukraine, which
Yeah,
is not just Robert Fico's position, but
exactly.
a fairly large proportion of the Slovak population appears to buck the kind of general European establishment line on Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I kind of look at the numbers, I mean, there's actually not a significant support for Russia itself. The main kind of support concentrates around the geopolitical central position of being kind of between the East and the West. What Robert Fico terms as a politic of four world directions, so that we need to be kind of friendly with each of the sides of the conflict. And it does definitely find significant support within the population, which is not anti kind of Ukrainian per se, but rather subscribes to the kind of narrative that the West is the kind of main culprit. It's also not the majority, likely not the majority of the population, but it's a fair share of that. And Robert Fico was simply very, very good in kind of pulling on the threads immediately after the Russian invasion of Ukraine of elements such as economic fear of the regional war. Also, Slovak society never really kind of cultivated this kind of traumatic memory of Russian encounters as the Poles did, for example.
Mm.
I mean, in Poland, this is a ritualized kind of relation to Russia that has some sort of historical roots. In Slovakia, I mean, one of the kind of liberal narratives is, of course, this kind of backwardness. Is that the Slovakia, there was a pan-Slavic movement in the 19th century, and we have cultivated a relation to Russia that is very positive. Yes, but at the same time, I think that what this position also owes to is the wide discontent in how the 90s and 2000s went down. Is I would say a big disappointment with the West. Part of that is the culture wars. I mean, many people subscribe to this kind of declinist narrative of liberal West, and a kind of declining values of Europe, and a threat to conservative values. And many people are simply kind of feel lied to, I guess, and have assumed a position that basically is very distrustful to whatever the kind of Western or EU elites seem to be arguing. So I think that Fico has very, very skillfully captured this sort of sentiment, and has basically been using it ever since. And I mean, on the top of that, it's of course sprinkled with stuff like anti-Ukrainianism that has been in some parts of the kind of Slovakia present since the Second World War, and stuff like this. So they are mobilizing a variety of these kind of narratives in order to kind of catch the widest possible sample, so to speak. And it basically translates then into this kind of sovereignist politics within the EU that Robert Fico actually has been articulating in some ways, especially also through his first government between 2006 and 2010. Then he became a big Euro optimist in his second and third terms. He was kind of pushing Slovakia to what he called the core of the EU, and now he's kind of turned away from that. I think also actually it has a personal component, because when he was prosecuted in 2021-22, he actually apparently wrote several letters to the European Commissions, which were not responded to. And he feels basically that they didn't stand behind him. So I think that there's always a combination of personal and political and
Leaving
political.
someone on unread, yeah, that's always going to spark geopolitical
Yeah,
tensions.
yeah, no, I mean exactly like this kind of ghosting experience, basically. And,
Just really briefly, because I do want to turn to your namesake in Ukraine. What impact and what kind of weight does Slovakia have to throw around in NATO? Like, what impact do you think Robert Fico's opposition to military aid to
yeah.
Ukraine kind of has, or is it something that can just be kind of brushed aside and ignored?
Yeah, well, okay. So, I mean, I think let me connect this to also the kind of EU question, because very briefly, because basically I think no, and they don't want to actually do much of anything. I think this is largely a political positioning, also with regards to kind of internal politics, because there's also a struggle between these, liberal, very pro EU progressives. So of course, Smer has to position on the extreme other side of the political spectrum. Hence, that also mean kind of articulating these narratives. But if you actually look at what they do in the EU, they've been behaving much better than Orban. If we talk about the NATO and Smer's call for peace, I mean, they haven't really done anything. Instead, I mean, Slovakia is, of course, still sending weapons to Ukraine, and the government is, in fact, injecting. I mean, they've injected 100 million euros just this year to the Slovak arms manufacturers, right? We have just bought F-16s from the US.
Hmm.
We just bought the aerial defense system from Israel. We've been kind of fulfilling the NATO 2% kind of commitment
So
for
it's
defense.
just rhetoric. It's
So,
rhetoric.
so basically, it's really largely rhetoric to kind of keep on his side the people who are discontent with the kind of European consensus. And behind the closed door, he does a lot of the. I mean, consider that. I mean, he's spinning this anti-Ukrainian rhetoric, and then of course he has a Fico and Smer. They invite Ukrainian government to Slovakia, and they agree on the regional development project. I think actually Slovakia was the only country that had this kind of direct intergovernment negotiations, and they will be traveling to Ukraine in next month or the month after. So he's kind of trying to basically play both sides, or all four sides, as he says, and it's largely a rhetoric. I mean, it doesn't really have much substance to. I mean, the only substance is really is to kind of create waves in the European Union position himself as a outstandingly important statesman.
Mm.
But I don't think that, and I don't think particularly it's actually working very well, because it seems that the only country that Slovakia is really now very, very friendly with is Hungary, which paradoxically is, so to speak, the only country in the world that has major problems with Slovak sovereignty. Right? Orban regularly takes picture in front of Great Hungary maps. In Siarto, the foreign affairs minister, as well. And apparently, suddenly Hungary is our only friend on the kind of international political spectrum. So I don't see this as a particularly successful strategy.
Yeah, so I suppose, a bigger question. Does this just speak to the, I suppose, Fico's own kind of chameleon-like character, or is it more I suppose are voters ultimately indifferent? Would you say they're happy to be kind of placated by this rhetoric and certain smear policies, but ultimately they don't care? Or is it simply a matter of the fact that this stuff, at the end of the day, it's kind of frothy compared to the more basic bread and butter issues, um, which Slovakian voters are more focused on compared to these other questions?
I think it's all of those, and I think it's also what actually plays a big role is the element of competence. I think that, consider the fact that in the past 22 years, Robert Fico is, or Smer as a party, is the only party that managed to steer its government to through the natural kind of 4-year tenure. We've never had, one center-right or kind of oppositional government that made it throughout the kind of whole tenure. They always fell apart. So I think that they have a massive, massive reputational problem in the fact that nobody basically believed them that they actually can, or the Smer voters don't believe them that actually they can govern. And mind you that in 2020, Smer lost a lot of voters who voted for the center-right or for the kind of parts of current opposition, and they were probably feel like they were very much let down by this change. So I think that the kind of element of Robert Fico can govern is a massive kind of contributor to the fact that people are not leaving the governing coalition now.
It's a fascinating portrayal, I suppose, because it's so much in contrast, like we've said, with other kind of populist figures in which with whom Fico is kind of always aligned in the international press. But at the same time, none of this kind of really makes it into the international press coverage of Slovakia or of Fico himself.
Yeah.
He's talked purely about as a populist and ranked alongside Trump and kind of Boris Johnson, and so incompetence, mendacity, the similar kinds of character flaws. All of these things are just assumed without ever actually being elaborated at all.
I'm not saying that they are, of course, like fantastically competent.
No, no, sure.
That would be, that would be a stretch because, for example, what is happening now? You see that it's ridden with mistakes. The new laws that they are kind of ushering through, well, my favorite one was that recently Slovakia or Smer government actually changed the criminal, novelized the criminal law. It's criminal legislative, basically in order to partially also decriminalize corruption. It was a systemic step on the side of Robert Fico to avoid any sort of prosecution for corruption charges in the future. So to sort of enshrine the kind of classic social contract between the elites internally in stone. But what they did, for example, was that by accident they significantly reduced the statute of limitation for rape because they miscalculated, right? So there's stuff like this kind of happening because they're ushering things in, at a very fast kind of pace. So there's a lot of kind of incompetence actually going on. But at the same time, I mean, Robert Fico is really good in definitely kind of creating the appearance of the skillful bureaucrat. And to a large degree, he is, but he also has to work with the rest of the material in the coalition, I think, which includes the Slovak National Party, that is a far right kind of small party of influence, of far right influencers, who have actually that kind of competence problem. So, but no, I mean, you're right. I mean, this kind of stands in a stark contrast to these kind of better internationally known leaders.
Mm. So, just to close off, I wanted to ask you about some of your, I guess, academic sociological work, particularly as it concerns charisma, which I find quite interesting. So, firstly, you've written in a co-authored article about your partial namesake Volodymyr Zelensky over in Ukraine, and the notion of charismatic mimicry. What is that, and why is it important for understanding populist or charismatic leaders?
Yeah, so it's a paper that we co-authored with Paul Josie, my colleague. He's from Hong Kong University, and basically it was right after the Russian invasion to Ukraine started. We could see like the stream of leaders coming to Kiev. Zelensky assumed his kind of camouflage, new style of quasi-military trappings, and lots of people started going to Kiev and started basically dressing the part. And I thought it was quite ridiculous, actually, and but fascinating in some ways, because I've never really seen that. And basically, the theory of charisma, at that stage that it is, kind of didn't really account for any sort of interactions between charismatic leaders and non-charismatic elites. Because I mean, we can think whatever we want about Zelensky, but certainly, I mean, he at that point had a kind of international presence that was very kind of in line with what Weber writes about charismatic personality. I mean, people kind of believe that he is the extraordinary individual, that his kind of power is based on his kind of personal ability to withstand the danger and remain in Kiev. And I was thinking, or we were thinking with Paul at that point, that some very interesting that this was especially in the West, and as his persona was received in the West, was kind of showing an interesting cracks in political representation in the West, because people were suddenly saying something like, "I wish we had somebody like that," right? Many people were saying like, "Oh my God, why are our own leaders so weak? And you have this kind of attractive, muscular, macho resistance leader." And it basically to me showed this kind of deficit of legitimacy that many Western leaders suffer from. And it
Mm.
was funny to see how they tried to solve it for a while by basically trying to dress like Zelensky and go to visit him in Kiev. Like, remember Macron, for example? He had this kind of photo shoot in like a commander's hoodie, a Sunday night in Elysian Palace. And actually, like, we had a prime minister whose name was Eduard Heger at that point. And maybe you remember the first visitors to Kiev was actually the prime ministers of Czechia, Poland, and Slovenia. And Slovakia didn't go, to much confusion among the Western commentators, because our prime minister was kind of briefed by the security detail that it's not really safe to go. Um, and he didn't go, and basically the reaction was absolutely horrible. So so eventually, like, he had to catch up and also dress the part, like take the helmet and go like 1 month later to see Zelensky as well. But I thought that was kind of interesting. And you know why it was also interesting? Because it's not very often that you see West European leaders go to beg for
Mm.
legitimacy to Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
right? And it also
Yeah,
shows some
absolutely.
sort of, excuse me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, it's a great point.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
it also, and it's almost like a kind of an overly literal illustration of the fact that they're using the Ukraine war as a means of legitimacy
yeah,
in Western capitals, but here actually just going and dressing up like Zelensky. That's yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so you don't really see that very often. So you could see sort of the geopolitical imaginaries, shaping up at that point, and basically we saw that in this kind of mimicry element. So that's that paper in
Yeah.
a brief.
Well, no, now that I'm attuned to this concept, I'm going to be, of course, seeing it everywhere. And I look forward to finding other examples. I think you even tweeted about. I think I saw you posting about after Trump got the failed assassination on Trump, that people at the RNC were wearing kind of ear patches to kind of.
Yeah, that's actually very common. I mean, it's that basically followers or charismatic followers basically try to mimic the leader to some degree. Um, I mean, but it's always funny also to watch, like, how close can you get with this kind of mimicking, right? Because I mean, if you mimic the leader too close, I mean, you can get pretty burned, or at least the leader kind of loses their extraordinary nature as a kind of otherworldly human being. But no, but this was exactly like the way of sharing in the experience of the kind of borderline experience of dying, and sharing in the miracle of not dying, by the kind of touch of faith. Yeah.
Well, I look forward to people around the world, but certainly Americans, mimicking this kind of unhinged wine mom laugh of Kamala Harris over the next 4 years.
Well, that's Yeah, but I mean, with this kind of East and West, I would like to see. I would be interested if ever we see again kind of Western leaders coming to Eastern Europe to ask for legitimacy. I mean, they did with Václav Havel, for example,
Yeah, that's
in the
yeah.
90s.
Yeah, it's an odd thing, isn't it? Because they did it with. I mean, the communists did it, obviously, and then you have, like you say, the kind of the dissident East Europeans. And yeah, it's but now Zelensky is kind of front line of the war against Russia, and I wonder if they'll, like you say, it could be what the next kind of the next model of legitimacy that Eastern Europe will export will be.
All right, Dominic, thank you very much for this. This has been hugely enlightening about a country which I have to admit to not knowing a great deal about.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and some great some great counter examples to the characteristics of the prototypical populist leader as well.
Thank you very much for inviting me.